How much does it cost to have a child in the US versus Europe? Have you ever thought of how much does it cost to have a child in general? It's quite a lot of money. You know, it's like the most best, awesome, expensive hobby you can ever have. But there are differences between the regions. And in this video, we're going to talk about the cost of having a child in the US versus Europe. And hi, if you're new to the channel, my name is Tero. I am a mushroom entrepreneur originally from Finland. And this is The Spore, my YouTube channel where I share things I've learned along the way in my life about business, health, wellness, but also cultural differences. I grew up in Europe. I've lived in 5 countries in Europe, and I've been spending the last 10 years in the US. I'm married to an American. We have 3 kids. So I'm fairly intimately aware of the cost of having a child in the US versus in Europe. Now, I've done videos before about finances in Europe versus US. In those videos, you'll find out things like salaries are double or higher in the US. Taxes, weirdly, as a percentage are lower. So your net income is much higher, but you do spend more on things in the US, so your expenses are higher. And one of these higher expenses is children. I don't think I'm surprising anyone to say that in the US, children cost more to have than in Europe. And today we're gonna break it down on what are those costs roughly. Few disclaimers. One is that not every state and not every country are the same. That's pretty obvious. If you live in Oklahoma, not the same as New York City. My experience is mostly from New York, LA, and Austin, although I have friends all over the country, but generally, I'm going to talk about urban examples. Same in Europe. I used to live in Switzerland. That is one of the more expensive places, along with things like Luxembourg and Norway. But then there's also a lot of cheap places. I've lived in Italy. It's surprisingly cheap. Cyprus would probably be the cheapest. Finland is somewhere probably in the middle, partly because there's amazing subsidies in Scandinavia. So yes, where you live matters a lot. The second thing is I'm going to talk about euros and dollars interchangeably. I don't want to start making currency exchanges. When I was a child, the euro was a lot more valuable than the US dollar, about 20% more valuable. Now they're pretty close, so I'm just going to use them interchangeably. Okay, so as an American, you earn more, maybe double, you pay less in taxes. So you do have more money to spare, but once we get into this children part, it kind of gets pretty crazy pretty soon. So kind of starting in somewhat chronological order, giving birth. How much did it cost in the US? Me and my wife did a home birth. We did a whole video separately. It's very popular if you want to check it out, why we went for a home birth. Home births, weirdly, are cheaper than hospital births. Now, insurance might not cover for it, but home birth can be anywhere from $3,000 to $8,000. Like $5,000 is pretty common cost. Now, you can always pay more if you want, but like for $5,000, you can get it done. Versus hospitals tend to be more like $10,000 to $30,000. Now, your insurance, if you have a good insurance in the US, you can cover for more. Versus in Europe, everybody's kind of starting from the same level. Versus in the US, things like what kind of insurance you have can dictate a lot on how much does things cost. So in Europe, cost of childbirth is often zero.
What?
Oh, you gotta be shitting me.
Almost every European country has pretty strong incentives for childbirth. We could do another video separately on the birth rates of these regions, but in Europe, it's about 1.44. US is a little better because of immigration than other places, but in Finland, it's very low, like 1.28, and the replenish rate is 2.1. So like a lot of these societies are declining, so the governments are somewhat incentivizing you to have kids. So childbirth is free in most cases, maybe some hundreds of euros or maybe 1,000, but not much. Once the child is born, in places like, for example, Finland, you do have like basically for life, free healthcare and support. So even if you're an infant and you have a baby, you don't spend much on the needs. Like you might opt in to buy some special things. These are often maybe costing a few €100 to if you get really nice strollers and stuff, yeah, a couple thousand. Versus in the US, it's very common to spend multiple thousands of dollars on an infant's needs. In Europe, the government provides these things for free, or often for very little money. Great example of this is the Finnish baby box, which has gotten a lot of PR in the US as well. Finnish baby box is a box that every single baby born in Finland gets. It's literally a box, and it basically covers for all your material needs for the first year. But also like your clothing and cribs come from the government. So this box comes depending on when your baby's born. So the sizing of the winter clothes changes higher or smaller depending if you're a spring or fall baby. And the box actually serves as a crib. Pretty clever and awesome. And some of the clothing is really high quality too. So in Europe, as a summary, once the baby's born, you pay some hundreds of euros maybe for the infant, versus in the US, it's many thousands. So multiple full times higher. Maternity leave, paternity leave, family leave, whatever you want to call it. In the US, it's basically none.
You gotta be kidding.
Some people are eligible for like 12-week, often unpaid. Now, some companies are more generous and they give it, but I think that's an exception, not the rule. In Europe, it's very common to have a year, even higher, places like Germany, Sweden, Finland, and that's paid. And you can actually be multiple years on a leave. The second, third year, it's just on a reduced salary, but it's not a zero. Still, the government will give you some money to be at home with your child. So I guess one cost of living is like opportunity cost or what you lost by not working. But then on a more positive end, you get money by being at home with your child. So whichever you prefer. But I think generally, having the optionality in Europe to get it is definitely better, because in Europe, you could still go back earlier if you wanted, but the government and the companies and the legislation offer you a longer maternity leave. And then in many cases, this also extends with limitations to the dad. The dad or the mom or the two parents can choose how to split the time. So often it's common that the dads are anywhere from like a couple months to up to a year at home as well. Okay, so now you have an infant, you've been home for none at all, or maybe a year. Now you're looking at daycare options. Daycare is often free or you pay very little in Europe.
What?
Again, huge variations between countries. Let's say at the high end of places, let's say France, you pay maybe 300 to 500 euros a month for infant daycare. And in Finland, you pay none. In Finland and some other countries, you get an allowance that is somewhere usually between 100 to 200 euros per child per month for your expenses. But in this case, the childcare would be free. In US, childcare is more expensive than schooling. It's actually pretty crazy. So annualized, people spend somewhere usually in 10 to 20,000 a year. Some spend 30,000 a year, but like it's pretty expensive to have daycare. Now, there are some cheaper options through churches and this and that. And I'm sure somebody in the comments is going to comment is like, oh, we paid only this much. But generally, childcare is very expensive in the US. 1,000 to 2,000 a month is not uncommon. Some pay 3,000 or even 4,000 a month, which is insane. In Europe, you pay none, or maybe in the high end, 500 a month. Okay, so now your child is a toddler or going to school or something like that. So schooling in the US, you have both public and private. In Europe, tends to be a lot heavier on public, especially in like K-12 or elementary school level. Almost everyone goes to a public school, and only later in like kind of high school, university level, there's public institutions. Now there's some notable exceptions, but a lot of my rich friends in Europe end up going to pretty regular public school. Now, some neighborhoods have better public schools than others, but the idea is pretty much the same. In the US, it's pretty common to go to a private school from early on. Our kids go to a Montessori school, but even the case of a lot of regular middle-class families, they feel unsafe about public schools, and therefore they put them kids in a private school. Those private schools, some are more cheaper, let's say 5 to 10K a year. And then others are more expensive, like 20 to 30K a year. But I think generally most people pay that 10 to 20,000 a year on schooling. Depends if you're part-time, full-time, 5 days a week, 3 days a week, early drop-off, late drop-off, clubs and stuff like that. If you want to give a lump number, I'd say 20,000 a year per child per year for the rest of your life, basically. Then hobbies in Europe, it's more common that you have hobbies outside of the school versus often in the US. Various hobbies are somehow school-related, extracurricular activities, or at least there's a connection with the school. But also like the cost of hobbies in the US tends to be pretty high compared to Europe. Even the more expensive one, let's say hockey, you're paying some thousands of dollars a year versus in the US, you could pay tens of thousands per year for your hobby, even at simple hobbies. So obviously the hobbies can be cheap. There's plenty of free options, but most American parents end up spending thousands of dollars on their children's hobbies, and that's not the case in Europe. I also find that in Europe, there's a bigger culture of hand-me-downs. Now that does exist in the US as well. We were fortunate enough to get a lot of cool clothes, and then we passed our clothes to other people, toys and stuff like that. Facebook Marketplace is a great place to get cheap stuff too. And we happen to live in a neighborhood where there's a lot of yard sales. Sometimes you get scores there. But I would say generally in Europe, everybody has hand-me-downs or secondhand stuff. And even like a more wealthier family would probably still somehow leverage those. So net, where did we end up with the cost of having a child? In Europe, depending on which country you're in, you're probably going to spend maybe 3,000 to 5,000 euros on the first year of the child, maybe 7, 8, 9,000 in the first year. In the following years, it's probably going to be less. But as a rule of thumb, I would generally say is that if you spend 3,000 to 5,000 per child per year in Europe. So you're responsible for the child for the first 17 years. So that in Europe, that just means that you're probably per child spending, let's say 50,000 to maybe 80,000 during those 17 years on the child out of pocket. It's partially because costs are lower. The biggest reason is that the quality of public education is much better and the government gives you more subsidies. You get things at a lowered rate or for free. And then on top of that, you get sometimes some sort of a family monthly payment of a few €100 too that help you fund those things. So in per child, obviously what I did not count is accommodation and food. Those, generally are cheaper in Europe too, but those are much more individualistic versus like the core kids' needs. If I would have to guess, I would say accommodation and food is also half the cost in Europe than it is in the US, maybe even 3 times more in the US. So what about in the US? Well, the numbers are going up. Maybe it was common that you spend about 10 to 15K a year per child. But as I noted, just the education alone can cost that much now. So I think it's more common that the average that gets spent is 20,000. And I think it's not crazy if people spend 30 to 50K per child on all the needs that the children. Now, again, in the US, there's probably a bigger spread of how much you spend. So if you look at the top few percent and bottom few percent in Europe of how much you spend per child, the difference is much smaller than the US, how much the lower income versus higher income people, the range is massive. But I think the average has been just under 20K a year and it's going higher. But at the same time, I think realistically, by the time if your child is born this year in 2024, and then you look at the next 17 years, I think an average people will probably spend more like 30 to 40K per child, with all the costs just keep climbing up and up and up and up. So that means that the cost of a child in the US today is a little over 300K per child. But I think realistically, if you're a new parent or planning to have kids, mentally, I would prepare to spend 400,000 to 500,000 for the first 17 years of their life. Also, by the way, in Europe, it's very common that at 18, you move out of the house, be independent. Yes, there's some notable exceptions like in Italy or somewhere where 30-year-olds are living with their parents, partly by force, by the way, because they make very little money there. But generally, like my experience is that parents in the US end up paying for a lot more expenses when the kids are in their 20s. So be it college and travel and hobbies, Americans rely a lot on their parents, especially today, for expenses even in 20s and 30s, versus in Europe, it's much culturally more normal is that like, hey, you're on your own, handle it. And I think the expenses are probably much, much higher, like spending $1 million or 700,000, 800,000 in the first 30 years of a child life is probably realistic in the US. Versus in Europe, what do you spend in the first 17 years is pretty much what you're gonna spend in the whole life. Even spending 100,000 per child is a lot in the first 30 years in Europe. So as a summary, I would say at low end, you probably spend 5-6 times more per child in the US than in Europe. And it could be as high as 10 times the amount in the US than you spend in Europe. Again, that's mostly due to government subsidies and support and more family-centric mindset of Europeans. Like a lot of costs living in the US is just like doing what everyone else is doing and the materialism and the spending and the habits. And some of it's on like policy and politics and what is deemed as a priority for the society. And in Europe, it's just a lot more family friendly. Hopefully this video was helpful. Leave a comment below about finances if you have experience in the US and Europe. Again, varies a lot by country and by state where you live and your lifestyle and your income level. But hopefully these kind of rough averages give you some indication how much would it cost to have a child. Either way, it's a lot. Wherever you live, having children will cost money, but it's also one of the greatest blessings. And I always think like, I don't know a better thing to spend money besides health and children. I don't know what the other stuff is. Maybe charity would be another one. All the other stuff are kind of like a little bit more dumb. So thanks for listening to the video. If you made it all the way here, hit like and subscribe, and check out some of my other videos on the side or below on the same topics. And I'll see you in my next video. Ciao, ciao.